Bundles of cash stashed away by Islamic militants in the Philippines. The military saying Tuesday its discovery of $1.6 million in banknotes and checks is evidence that Islamic State-linked fighters are quickly fleeing their hideouts in the besieged city of Marawi. Reuters' Neil Jerome Morales reports from the city where troops are battling insurgents for control.
Islamist militants use this large amount of cash to purchase their own high-powered weapons, to purchase vehicles, to strengthen their cause. The fact that they left this large amount of cash means they have other priorities, particularly moving to other areas, changing positions for the snipers that are giving the government headache in terms of fighting these rebels and taking back the city of Marawi. Also, the government has found networks of tunnels connecting these houses, and there's a stash of ammunition. There are weapons that were previously prepared by the militants and were found by the militants in the homes of Marawi city residents.
The insurgents are now cornered in a small but built-up section of the town after 2 weeks of intense combat with armed forces. According to the military, the cash pile suggests the militants have links with international terrorist groups, although it's unclear if that's where the money came from.
It's no surprise that the government seized that much of cash and checks inside the house previously controlled by the Islamist militants. Historically, people of Marawi, particularly the businessmen, keep their cash inside their homes instead of banks. And in the first day of the siege, the Islamist militants looted a local bank.
Hundreds of civilians still remain trapped in Marawi or held hostage. The prolonged battle sparking fears that ISIS is building a regional base in the southern Philippine island of Mindanao.
You're watching Reuters TV. Here are your top stories.
Trump gets involved in the fight that split the Arab world.
Paris police stop an attack at Notre Dame.
Art imitates strife as Britons head to the polls.
This is Reuters Now.
Wading into the worst rift between powerful Arab states in decades. US President Donald Trump saying Tuesday that his trip to the Middle East last month was already paying off, as Arab leaders accuse Qatar of funding militant groups. His blunt remarks on Twitter suggesting that the anti-Islamist speech he gave in Riyadh in May inspired Arab powers to cut diplomatic ties and suspend flights to Qatar. US officials in Washington, though, telling Reuters they were blindsided by Saudi Arabia's coordinated move against Doha. Egypt, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates immediately followed suit. People panic buying in Doha on Tuesday. Videos posted on social media showing empty shelves and shoppers stocking up. Saudi Arabia also revoking the license of Qatar Airways and ordering its offices to close. Qatar denies the Arab ruler's accusations that it backs Iran and supports what they called terrorism. Trump saying Arab leaders warned him on his trip that Qatar was funding, quote, radical ideology after he'd demanded they take action. Adding perhaps this will be the beginning of the end to the horror of terrorism. His intervention appears to contradict the picture US officials painted on Monday, in which the United States would quietly calm the waters between Riyadh and Doha. Tiny Qatar, the world's richest state per capita, seen as too important to US military and diplomatic interests to be isolated. It hosts the largest US airbase in the Middle East, a staging ground for US-led strikes on Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria.
Paris police have shot a man who assaulted an officer with a hammer outside the city's Notre Dame Cathedral. Law enforcement sources telling Reuters the man threatened officers with the hammer and was shot in the torso when he refused to stop. One officer sustained light injuries, they say. The extent of the suspect's wounds wasn't made clear. France's interior minister says the suspect shouted, "This is for Syria." During the incident, the country's counterterrorism office has already opened an investigation. Europe is in the midst of a wave of militant attacks inspired by Islamic extremism, and Paris has seen some of the worst of those incidents. Tuesday's attack taking place at one of the city's top tourism spots. It comes just days after militants staged a knife and vehicle attack in London.
The offensive to retake the Syrian city of Raqqa has begun, Islamic State's de facto capital and a hub for planning attacks against the West. It lies to the east of Syria's second city, Aleppo, and its fall will be the militant group's biggest loss. The militants' aim of building a caliphate is crumbling as the group is driven out of Iraq and Syria. Raqqa has been their headquarters since 2014. Forces began encircling the city in November, but face a tough battle ahead. A spokesman from the militia says they believe ISIS will fight street to street and have dug tunnels under the city. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates there are over 2,000 IS fighters in Raqqa and up to 170,000 civilians. The offensive, led by the SDF, an alliance of militia groups, including Arab and Kurdish fighters, has raised alarm bells in Turkey. The umbrella group includes the Kurdish militia group, the YPG. The US decision to arm them has angered Ankara. Turkey views the YPG as the Syrian extension of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, considered a terrorist group by the US, Turkey and Europe. Experts believe Islamic State will be defeated militarily before the year is up. They've nearly been pushed out of Mosul in neighbouring Iraq, a fight that's taken months longer than expected. Stamping out their ideology, however, is a battle with no time frame.
Bill Cosby's primary accuser taking the stand Tuesday, former Temple University employee Andrea Constand testifying with harrowing details that the comedian drugged and sexually assaulted her in 2004. Constand described Cosby as a mentor, someone she trusted. One night he allegedly gave her what he said were herbal pills. Then, she told the court, she felt frozen. He then groped and molested her as she couldn't move, adding, quote, "I wanted it to stop." Reuters legal correspondent Joseph Axe was at the courthouse Tuesday.
This was a big moment in the Bill Cosby scandal. This was the first time they've been face-to-face in a long time since all this broke. And while she was describing to jurors what she said happened at his home on his couch, he was shaking his head, he was putting his hand over his forehead, he was whispering to his attorneys, but he was clearly registering that he disagreed with her testimony. Constand mostly kept it together. She didn't cry much that I saw. Her voice quavered at times, but she was a pretty strong witness in terms of kind of her demeanor. She told the story, she didn't get too emotional. And even during cross-examination, when the defense was going after her fairly hard, she didn't crack at all. This was the dramatic moment that everyone had been looking for when this trial began. She's clearly the hinge on which the outcome of the trial is going to turn. And so it was a pretty dramatic moment. When she took the stand, she walked into the courtroom, there was a lot of murmuring. And when she first began to talk about her relationship with Cosby, people in the audience were riveted.
Dozens of women have accused Cosby of sexually assaulting them under similar circumstances in a series of attacks dating back to the 1960s. Cosby, who his lawyers say is legally blind, is not expected to testify, though he has denied allegations against him.
Ms. Carter? 20-year-old Michelle Carter of Plainville, Massachusetts, waiving her right to a jury this week in an unusual trial over whether she drove her high school boyfriend to suicide. In text messages, Carter, who was 17 at the time, told Conrad Roy, quote, "You need to just do it." When Roy expressed second thoughts, Carter encouraged her boyfriend to get back into his truck, where authorities later found his body and the vehicle filled with carbon monoxide. Prosecutors say the text messages and phone calls made before and during the suicide prove that Carter persuaded Roy to kill himself. Carter's lawyer argues the text messages are protected free speech. Her decision to forego the right to a jury means members of her community will not get to decide her fate. The case will now be tried by the judge. Carter is charged with involuntary manslaughter and faces up to 20 years in prison if convicted.
As the death toll rises in Afghanistan's battle against the Taliban, local soldiers say they're being stretched thin. Whether it's lack of equipment, poor leadership, or chronic corruption, government forces are facing a range of problems and they're desperate for international support. But as Reuters correspondent Mirwais Harouni explains, the one thing they don't want is foreign troops returning to the front lines.
Afghan experts say that it's much better to have Afghan forces on the battleground. They believe that Afghan forces, they know their villages, homes much better than foreigners know. And they also say that in special occasions, like for example, when a district center or a province center is on the verge of collapse, foreign forces should help and should support. But in other cases, they should just provide training and advices to the Afghan security forces, and that's enough.
16 years since the U.S.-led campaign that ousted the Taliban, the U.S. is planning to send up to 5,000 military trainers to the area, prompting concern in Afghanistan that Washington could get sucked back into the war. NATO has repeatedly said it won't resume the combat mission that ended 3 years ago, but officials say plans are being considered to have military trainers from outside participate in operations as Afghan forces struggle to contain the spreading insurgency.
Afghan national security forces do not have enough personnel on the ground. They say that whenever they go to an operation, as soon as they finish that operation, they have to go to another one. That's the reason that when they leave an area, Taliban and other insurgent groups come back to their stronghold.
With the Taliban in control of about 40% of Afghanistan's territory, those insurgent strongholds are becoming increasingly difficult to contain.
Uber telling its employees Tuesday that it's firing more than 20 people, the result of a wide-ranging internal investigation into sexual harassment claims made by former employees. That's according to a person familiar with the internal probe being carried out by an outside law firm. Reuters correspondent Joseph Men has the details.
In addition to investigating more than 200 specific complaints of harassment, retaliation, and other issues, and acting in at least 58 of those cases so far, it's also instituted policy changes. Those include much deeper training for managers. It turns out that more than half of Uber's managers have never been bosses before.
The source telling Reuters that more cases of harassment are still ongoing, and Men says those are just the ones being investigated internally.
This is just one of multiple probes that are being conducted. Probably the most prominent one, that shoe is still to drop. That's being conducted in part by former Attorney General Eric Holder. The special committee of the board has gotten briefed on Mr. Holder's recommendations, and those will be conveyed to employees sometime next week.
Aside from Tuesday's terminations, Uber's had a lot of executive turnover. The company's seeking a COO, a CFO, and other senior leaders. Uber is also embroiled in significant civil litigation with Google's Waymo over accusations a former Uber executive stole trade secrets related to its self-driving car technology.
Uber's got a lot going on, and it's going to continue to be a distraction for some time to come.
Mapping the fault lines in a divided Britain. A new exhibition by British artist Grayson Perry exploring the fissures opened by last year's Brexit vote. It's opening at London's Serpentine Gallery on the day of the UK general election.
I think it's a happy coincidence that I'm opening on election day. I think the thing about Brexit was it was a perfectly pitched moment more than an actual question. I think it just had, it was a point when there was a kind of cultural divide in the country, and what the referendum did, it presented a yes-no, black and white question at just the right moment in our society where there was sort of unacknowledged grievances by a large section of society, and they hung those on the EU debate.
At the centre of the exhibition, 2 Brexit vases, their appearance crowdsourced via social media from Leave and Remain voters. And they look more similar than you might think. Perry says that suggests the 2 camps might not be so far apart after all.
I think there was a sort of element of patronisation about the Remain campaign. They're saying you're stupid for voting Leave. And then there was also a kind of man in the street, sort of street fighter version. You know, Nigel Farage, and Aaron Banks, those people. You know, they did a very intuitive campaign that worked. And I think that it almost was a kind of cultural divide in Britain. Whether it was anything to do with the EU, I wouldn't know, but that's why it was so loaded, because it was playing perfectly into a set of emotions on either side around education, change, whether you feel left behind, and all those sorts of issues. And that emotion will dissipate.
Maybe not soon, though. Polls for Thursday's election almost evenly balanced, suggesting Britons are starkly divided over the country's future direction. And perhaps that is why, between the two Brexit vases, Perry has placed his sculpture Our Mother, a representation of refugees everywhere, and a reminder that there are issues that go beyond party politics.
You're up to date. Check back later as stories develop.